Circle skirts are not circles. Firstly, you should always drop the center front and center back down by 1 centimeter at the waist. This will just add more volume to your skirt. So it kind of pulls the fabric up, puts it in tension, it sort of flares out really nicely. It's just a hack that we use in the industry a lot. Secondly, you need to account for the bias on your fabric. So when a fabric's on the bias, whether it's even a diagonal seam or on a circle skirt, it will always drop. And there are calculations you can find to sort of preempt this. Do not use these. Every fabric is different, even the same fabric in a different color acts differently. So if you've got a really solid, stiff, sort of almost canvas-like cotton, that will drop a lot less than a really loosely woven, beautiful light chiffon. So do what we do in the industry and put it on the mannequin. Cut your pattern in your final fabric, then sew the side seams together and put it on your mannequin, or a hanger if you don't have a mannequin. See how the skirt hem is already uneven? I deliberately chose a light, loose weave fabric so I could clearly demonstrate the bias dropping, but even I'm surprised by how bad it is already. This is why you can't just draw a circle. Anyway, put it on the mannequin and go to bed. Give it about 24 hours and the skirt will have dropped on the bias, and you can just measure it and mark the correct length. My skirt was 45 centimeters long, so I'm just measuring 45 centimeters down across the whole skirt. You can use a pro hem marker to do this rather than what I'm doing, and when you're done, you can just trim it off. If I hold at the back, you can see how nice and straight the front is now. If you're going to send this pattern into production, or you're going to make another sample with the exact same fabric, has to be the same fabric, it's best idea to cut this excess off all in one piece. Then you can do this. Just lay it on top of your pattern and trace around it. Now your pattern has taken the bias into account. Doesn't look much like a circle, does it? So they're the two basic pattern making hacks that everyone in the industry knows about and does. But this video is really about teaching you a more intuitive way to create circular or flare shaped patterns. And creating circle patterns is one of the most popular pattern making and sewing tutorials on YouTube. But a lot of other videos also have really important details. And they will show you how to do sort of full 360 skirts, or 3/4 to 70-degree skirts, or 180 half skirts, or 90-degree flared skirts, using these sort of high school geometry calculations. This video is different. Yes, those calculations do kind of work, but they don't allow you to have control over where and how much volume you add to your skirt. So this is my no degrees, no radius, no circumference approach to creating circle skirts. And this is how I would create patterns when I work. I worked for Alexander McQueen and Jenny Packham. I spent the last decade working for very high-end designers, mostly in London. And this is how I would approach creating any sort of circular or flared skirt. In this video, you'll learn how to build your base silhouette using flat pattern making techniques. Then I'll show you how to create beautiful flounce detailing at key points so you can get really creative. And then I'll show you how to finish your pattern. And by finishing your pattern, I don't mean just adding seam allowances and accounting for the bias. We're going to go through some cautionary tales that always happen when you have big circular skirts. We'll talk about finishes, so how you can select finishes and add some detailing that will make your skirt have more volume. We'll talk about making sure your seams are on a similar sort of grain and doing lay plans, that kind of stuff. This is the skirt pattern I'll be creating during this demo. And the best part is it has pockets, because everything should have pockets. So I'll be showing you how to make pockets for skirts, which is different for how you make pockets on dresses. Before we start, I want you to press pause, grab some paper or have a little search on Pinterest and come up with an idea of a kind of circular or flared skirt that you want to make. Here are some looks from Fashion Week to get you started. And remember, you can always practice at quarter scale first if you don't feel confident yet. Okay, let's start the tutorial. The first thing you need to do is think about how long you want your skirt to be. Here are some industry standard lengths taken from the waist that you can use as a guide. Then you need to measure your waist and hip. So grab a measuring tape and you want to put it firm but not too tight on your body and keep it horizontal. For example, if I make mine really tight, I can get, and don't breathe, get down to sort of 68 or 69 kind of comfortably. I like to put sort of 2 fingers in here, just so I've got a bit of extra wiggle room so I can eat and breathe in my skirt. So I'm going to do 73 centimeters to my waist, and I'll measure my hip too. And when I'm done, I'll write those measurements down. Now you need to think about your finishes. You'll need some sort of waistband, and you could put an elastic band inside the waistband. So this will sort of gather the fabric when the elastic comes in. Or you could do a bit of a cleaner look, like I'm going to do, with just a waistband and visible zip. If you do an elastic band, when we create or draft our pattern in the next step, you'll need to use your hip measurement plus a little bit extra wiggle room rather than using your waist measurement. so you'll need to get over your hip easily with the elastic. Now let's start drafting our pattern. Draw a rectangle as long as your chosen skirt length. My design has an uneven hem, so I'll use the length of my longest part. And don't worry, you can change this later too. So we're going to do separate patterns for the front and back, so there will be a side seam, which is where my zip will go. And because I'm doing a working pattern, so I'm just working everything out, I'm going to put my pattern on the fold, so I'm just going to do half the front and half the back. So this is my center front and the side seam, and the center front is on the fold. I'm also going to make the center front my grain line. And the width will be half your front waist measurement because the pattern is on the fold. Important thing to note here, your back waist is about 4 to 5 centimeters, so 1.5 to 2 inches smaller than your front waist measurement, so the side seam isn't in the middle. To work out half of your front waist measurement, remember the pattern's on the fold, get your full waist measurement and divide it by 4. Now I have 4 equal sections here. And to make the front bigger, just add 1 centimeter or half an inch to that number. And for the back, you do the same thing, but minus 1 centimeter or half an inch. See how adding 1 centimeter to the front and subtracting 1 centimeter from the back has shifted the side seam? And this is the only bit of maths I promise. So I get my waist measurement, which was 73 centimeters, and divide it by 4, then add 1 centimeter. And my rectangle width will be 19.25 centimeters. If you're doing an elastic waistband, measurement will need to be half your hip front measurement, not the waist. And I would also add about 2 centimeters, so 3/4 of an inch to each side, to each seam of the side seam, so 8 centimeters in total. This will give you enough room to get the skirt really easily over your hip and your widest point, which is usually below your hip around the crotch area. Before we add the flare, draw a horizontal line 20 centimeters down from the top. This is your hip line. When we add flare, we need to make sure we add enough to go around the hip quite comfortably. To work out how big your half front hip measurement is, use the same calculation as before, but with your full hip measurement, not the waist. Then, right next to your hip line. Now let's start adding our flare. And to do that, we're going to draw slash lines along the length of our pattern. How many you add is up to you. The more you add though, the more control you'll have, and the more points you'll have to blend to when you draw your seams. I want 5 sections, so I'm going to divide my width by 5, which is about 4 centimeters, so I'll space my slash lines about every 4 centimeters. Then cut along the slash line from the hem, stopping just before the waist. The great thing about this method is you can now control the amount of volume you add at certain locations. So even if a skirt is meant to look sort of evenly flared, I often add a bit more to the center or add a bit less to the sides, just to make it look a bit more flattering. And also when I'm thinking about how much I want to add, often I'll grab my measuring tape and put it around my body at certain points, so at the hip and the circumference. This just sort of gives me an idea of how big the circle or skirt will be. Just a nice way to get an idea before you start toiling. Spread evenly or unevenly, it's up to you. This skirt is spread evenly and it's about 90 degrees, so it's a flared skirt that won't have too much extra width across the hip. And this one is uneven, has a lot more volume. It's getting close to 180 degrees and there is a lot more flare in the center, which will look really beautiful and become a design feature. It's best to put a piece of paper behind the pattern. It doesn't need to be a full piece, but it gives you something to secure the sections to while you play around. And I always use magic tape so I can remove it and move the pieces around without tearing the paper. And when you're happy with the shape, tape the sections down to your paper and grab your measuring tape and measure along the hip line to make sure the skirt pattern is bigger than your half front hip measurement. If it's smaller, spread your slash lines more. Before we blend the points, let's bring the center front down by 1 centimeter. Remember that super simple trick I told you at the beginning? It's just a really easy way to add more volume to your skirt. It sort of brings the fabric up and puts it in tension so that it flares out. So I'll mark a point 1 centimeter or half an inch down from the center front waist and drop the hem by 1 centimeter too, so the center front stays the same length. Then redraw the waist and hem. Aim to hit the center of each slash and spread section at the sides and in the middle, then continue down at the front here to the mark we just drew. And make sure your waist and hem seams are perpendicular, so at a 90-degree angle at the center front and the side seam. If you have done a really big flared skirt, it can be hard to connect all the points at the hem. Just do your best, try and create a beautiful, smooth, circular line. And remember that when you account for the bias later on, the hem's going to change anyway. And if you want some extra points, you can just get your measuring tape, put it at the waist, and measure down to your skirt length and make a mark. And the great news is you can actually use this pattern to create your back pattern. So the back pattern is going to have the exact same amount of volume as the front. All you need to do is just trace the pattern and then make the back pattern slightly smaller. So remember how the full back waist, so the total back waist there, is about 4 centimeters smaller than the front. So you just need to make it a bit smaller. Make a copy of the front and then chop 2 centimeters or 3/4 inch off the whole side seam. And you're done. And if you're wondering why I chopped 2 centimeters and not 4 centimeters, remember this is only half the back pattern, and half of 4 is 2. And if you want the back to have a different amount of volume, so maybe less than the front, copy the slash lines across when you trace your front pattern, and then just change the amount that you spread the slash sections. And that's the end of stage 1. So now you've got the basic shape or silhouette of your circular skirt all worked out, and now I'm going to show you how to do more sort of interesting flounce detailing and how I would approach it. If your design doesn't have any flounce detailing and you want to just skip this section and go straight to finishing your pattern, by all means, skip ahead. However, I would always recommend toiling your skirt pattern, because while you can see the amount of volume that you've added, it is actually really hard to visualize how it will fall on the body. Even if you just twirl it up in calico, like I have, you can get an idea of how it's falling, and you might want to make changes to it. Maybe you want to add more to one section, take some away. I really recommend toiling your patterns anyway. On my mannequin is a toile of my base silhouette. Before cutting it in calico, I added 1 centimeter seam allowances and then cut it on the fold so I have both sides. My design is asymmetric, so before I add the flounce detailing, I'm going to trim the hem. It's important the hem is pretty accurate, as the weight of the fabric pulls the volume down and reduces it. So to view your volume accurately, toile in a similar fabric and make sure the hem is the correct length. Now I'm going to use the slash and spread technique to add volume to create the flounce detailing. And I'm just going to cut into areas I think are looking a bit flat and then pin triangles of calico in there. Sorry if you're expecting hours of beautiful draping here, but I like to get accurate results quickly. And there is no way you could work out this by using flat pattern making. It's just way too hard to predict how and where the volume would appear. And it would probably be helpful if I put the camera down a little bit lower so you can see the whole thing. It's important to make sure your hem is a nice smooth curve shape. It shouldn't be wavy, which is why I'm being very careful about where I trim the hem to try and keep a line really smooth with a subtle curve. Just so you know, my mannequin is about 7 centimeters smaller than my waist, that's why there's all this excess on the back here that I've just pinned out. I also use the slash and spread technique to take volume out, and I think there's too much in the back here, so I literally just pin down the fabric. And I'm just assessing the volume as I go. I'm going to insert a crinoline tape along my hem, and this will help the flounce stick out more, but for now I'll just have to sort of visualize it. And you can see it's getting a bit messy. When I get to the point that I'm happy with the hem shape and the amount of volume, I'm going to remove my toile, lay it over some fresh calico, and cut it out again. I will definitely want to check this pattern again before I make my sample. I think I'm happy with the shape. Since I'm making it for me, I'll try it on too. Okay, I definitely need the crinoline tape to get the flounce stick out the way I want it to, but otherwise I'm happy with the shape. I think I took too much off the hem here, so I'll lengthen it when I create my next toile, but otherwise I think we're looking pretty good. Now, I'll pin my front and back drape to a fresh piece of calico. Because the pattern pieces have become so big now, they don't actually fit across the width of my fabric, so I've had to change the grain line. So instead of the centre front and centre back going along the length of the fabric, they now run across it, which is quite common for big flared pattern pieces. When you're pinning your toile down, it's important the waist area is flat. The waist circumference must be accurate. Because I pinned on the mannequin, there's always a chance I haven't pinned things evenly, so I can't get the toile 100% flat, but it's important the area on the waist is, so prioritise that, and if the hem's a bit off, don't worry. Now, I'll just cut around the drape to get my new fresh toile. And here's my new toile and mannequin again. I think I'm pretty happy with it, but let's see what it looks like with the crinoline. I'm using a 3.2 centimeter crinoline tape. I prefer crinoline tape rather than cutting strips from a crinoline fabric roll. It just, the tape is more flexible and it can stretch and compress more around curves. Yay, lots more volume. It's all coming together. One last try on. I think it's looking pretty good, but it has a bit too much flare on the side seam here, so I'll just pin that out. I don't like when side seams have too much flare because they collapse in on themselves. Now, I'll unpin my calico toile and trace around to create my front and back skirt pattern. Once you're happy with the shape, you can add your hem and seam allowances. I use metric, so I'll add 1 centimeter seam allowances. If you're imperial, add ½ inch. And don't forget to notch the seam allowance corners and hip line. If your skirt has a zip, you need to mark where the zip finishes on your side seam. The length of the zip will depend on how much flare you have. If you don't have a lot of flare, so it's closer to like 90 degrees, the zip will need to finish about 18 centimeters from the waist. However, if your skirt is much fuller, so it's closer to 360, the zip can finish about 10 centimeters below the waist. To mark the zip, put a notch where the zip will finish and draw an arrowed line along the zip length and write insert zip left-hand side only. If you're a designer using this pattern for sampling or production, create the other side of your pattern. Your pattern should not be on the fold. And just put the zip finishing notch and sewing instructions on the left-hand side. When it comes to the hem allowance, you need to think about what will look best for your fabric. All the guides in my CLIQD Pattern Kits have a section that helps you select the best hem allowances and seam finishes for your patterns. So I'll just refer to that. And I'm going to do a faced hem because I'm using medium weight fabric and my hem is curved, so I can't actually fold it along the hem. Having a faced hem or rolled up hem with a large width is actually a really great way to add sort of volume to your skirt. The fabric wants to hang down, right, because of gravity. But if you have something pushing it out, so like the strength of the facing there, the extra fabric, it'll actually push the skirt out to give it more volume. And I'm also going to add crinoline inside my facing, so that crinoline, which is often used on sort of like old school petticoats and that kind of thing, and a lot of couture to make big voluminous shapes look even bigger. I'm going to put that inside my facing, so that will sort of push my skirt out a bit. And this is my pattern so far. I traced around my toile fabric to create my pattern. I then double checked my waist measurement was the correct length, trued my side seams to make sure they were the same length, and then smoothed out my hem. Then I decided 1 centimeter to the hem, because essentially this is just a seam allowance used to attach my facing. Now I'll create my facing pattern. If you don't want to learn about facings, feel free to skip this section. To create my facing pattern, I'll grab some paper long enough to copy the entire hem. Facings are usually on the inside of the skirt, so they aren't visible. And if you want to do that, put the paper so the right side, with all the crosses, is facing down. It's always a good idea to make your pattern the way it should be cut, so right side facing up. We all get tired, and our default is to look at the pattern, see the writing, see the notches, and then lay that on top of the fabric. And yes, you can write cut wrong side up, but just in case you forget, the person cutting your fabric doesn't decide to check, it's just easy to have it the right way facing up. But I'm going to use my facing as a design feature, and I want it to be visible on the outside of my skirt, so I don't need to flip the paper around. Before I copy the hem, I'll make sure the grain lines of the skirt and facing paper are lined up correctly so they're both on grain, and then I'll pin the two pieces of paper together. Then I'll grab my tracing wheel and trace over the skirt hem and about 6 centimeters of my side seams. Once I'm done, I'll unpin the paper. I need to add some notches along the hem first. Then I'll draw along the lines I just traced. And the next thing to do is add my facing width. Most facings are 3 to 4 centimeters wide, so about 1.5 inches, but I want quite a wide facing, so I'm turning it into a design feature. So I'll draw a line 5 centimeters away from the hem edge, all the way across. Then I'll add a 1 centimeter seam allowance around the whole facing piece. And that's the facing pattern. Now I'm going to show you how to add pockets. And adding pockets to skirts is a bit different from adding pockets to dresses, because you can attach the pocket bag to the waist seam there. This makes it a lot more comfortable, easier to sew, and also more durable. I usually start the pocket opening about 8 centimeters, so 3 1/4 inches down from the waist. And my pocket opening, so where you put your hand in, is 14 centimeters wide, so 5.5 inches. But this time, I'm going to have the pocket open all the way to the waist and extend the pocket bag to the waist seam. This will make it easier to sew and more secure. To do this on my pattern, I'll measure 22 centimeters down along the side seam of my front pattern. This is where the pocket opening will end. Then I'll place my hand just above it at the same angle it would be if it were in the pocket, and just draw a nice curved shape around it. Then I'll extend the shape up to the waist seam. One thing to note, if your pattern isn't symmetrical and the waist seam is a different shape near the side seam, like mine is, you need to create a separate pocket for each side because the shape at the top will be different. Once I'm happy with the shape, I'll grab a piece of pattern paper and trace off the pocket outline, making sure I copy the grain line from my skirt too. They should be the same. Then I'll add my seam allowances. I'll label the pattern pocket and write cutting instructions: cut 2 per self if your pattern is symmetrical, or cut 1 per self if your pattern is asymmetrical, like mine. Because the pocket bag opening is so big, you will definitely see some of the pocket fabric when you open the seam or put your hands in. So that's why I'm cutting the pocket in self fabric, which I would usually do anyway if I can. But if you can't find or you can't use the self fabric, I try and find a really similar looking fabric. The waistband for this skirt is just a rectangle, and it's attached to the top of my skirt, so it should be the same length. My skirt is at the waist, and my waist measurement was 73 centimeters long, so my waistband is 73 centimeters long. For the waistband width, I usually do somewhere between 3 and 4 centimeters, so 1 1/4 inches to 1.5, and I'm going to do 4 centimeters for this waistband. You can have a seam along the top of the waistband, but the easiest thing to do is just double the width and then fold it in half when you're sewing. So whatever width you want your final waistband to be, double it when you create your pattern. So my width is 8 centimeters. And draw a line along the center and write fold line next to it. Then just add your seam allowances. Make sure you notch all the corners and put a notch at each end of the fold line too. You can also add notches at the center front, side seam and center back so you can attach the skirt correctly to your waistband. Then label your pattern waistband and write cutting instructions, cut 1 self plus fuse. And our pattern is done. But before we sort of pack it away and start making our sample, I want to share a couple of cautionary tales with you. So when we get carried away creating these really big, beautiful shapes, often we forget to check whether the pattern will actually fit on the width of our fabric, especially for smaller fabrics. And this happens really often in the industry, especially when you're grading patterns. It might just fit a size 8, and then you find that size 14, 16 doesn't actually fit in the fabric anymore, and then the factory's got to sort of make a little hack job somewhere. So check your fabric, check your pattern fits on your fabric width, and if it doesn't, you need to either sort of change the side seams or maybe add a style line somewhere, or you can do what they often do in bridal and evening wear, especially on bias dresses. Often you'll see that the really long ones have a sort of corner cut off the edge there. This is because it won't fit on the width of the fabric. So what you do if you want to do that, you just sort of just in the pattern work out which bit is going to go over the selvage there, and that will become sort of style line. So that will be sort of separate corner piece there. And the other thing you need to sort of think about, don't change your design to do this. But if you can, it's always good to have joining seams being on a similar grain line. So if you've maybe seen some dresses somewhere with sort of style lines or diagonal lines, you might notice that one of the seams is still flat, but there'll be sort of puckering along the other seam. That's because one side of the pattern is on grain and the other one's probably slightly at a bias. And while when we make our sample, we will check that we will adjust the pattern for the bias when we let it drop overnight. It will still drop over time. So if one of your seams is on the straight grain and the other one's on the bias, it will eventually start puckering, and you'll have sort of fabric puckering on it. So if you can, try and plan your pattern so that the joining seams are on a similar sort of grain, so then they'll move in the same way during the life of the piece. And once you've done all that, just click on the card that's just popped up and I'll show you how to sew your flared skirt. So we're going to cover how to do French seams, how to sew pocket bags, how to do an invisible zip and waistband, and how to add the facing with the crinoline. So lots of fun things. And subscribe to my channel for more pattern making videos to help you bring your designs to life.